Hey, I'm Alex. This is Big Al Books, and I'm here today doing my June wrap up. So I made it through 14 books this month, and I kind of mixed it up in regards to what I was reading. So I'm going to be arranging this video in order of genre. So I'm going to be starting off with all the nonfiction that I read, moving into the short stories, and then doing the novels at the end. So please feel free to skip around depending on what kind of books that you like to read. I know 14 books is a lot to squeeze in into one video, but let's give it a try. Starting off with some nonfiction, 3 of the books that I read this month I have talked about in much greater detail in a previous video of mine. So if you're interested in hearing more about these books, please check out my essential nonfiction reading recommendation list, where I talk about books that will give you a better understanding of Canadian history, especially in regards to the relationship between the Canadian government and Indigenous people. So the 3 books that I read that relate to that topic were Clearing the Plains, Disease of Politics of Starvation and the Loss of Aboriginal Life by James Daschuk. This is a scholarly and very well-researched book that will teach you about a period of Canadian history that we don't talk about nearly enough, and that was about all the Indigenous people living on the plains and how waves of disease affected them when European settlers moved to North America, as well as how Sir John A. Macdonald's government did a lot of quite horrible things, such as withholding food and using starvation as a way to get First Nations people to sign treaties and to keep them on reserves. So it's a very disturbing chapter of Canadian history, but very necessary. I also read Indigenous Rights, A Guide to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit Issues in Canada by Chelsea Vowel, who is a Métis lawyer, educator, and blogger. She's fantastic. This book is an excellent starting point if you're looking to learn more about Indigenous issues in Canada. It's kind of looks like a textbook, but it is very accessible, and this book covers a lot of heavy topics, but I guarantee you'll be laughing as well. So this is an excellent entry point, or if you're looking for a refresher on some basics. And the last book that I read regarding to this topic was Children of the Broken Treaty, Canada's Lost Promise and One Girl's Dream by Charlie Angus. This is a book about how the Canadian government continues to fail First Nations children in regards to providing proper healthcare or education. And in particular, this is about the First Nation community in Northern Ontario called Attawapiskat. And Charlie Angus writes about how Attawapiskat is home to Canada's largest youth-led civil rights movement, where a group of students got together in Attawapiskat and created this social media campaign where they informed the rest of Canadians what was going on and how they didn't have access to a proper school. And this is a very interesting book because it is very disappointing and frustrating when you read about how the government responds to these children asking for a school, but it is also very hopeful and inspiring when you see how other young people across the country respond and when you see the amazing strength of these leaders coming out of this movement. So it's kind of one of those books that's frustrating, but there's a silver lining there as well. Moving on to some of the other nonfiction that I read this month. This one's called Against Empathy, The Case for Rational Compassion by Paul Bloom. And this one's really not as radical as the title suggests, but basically Paul Bloom is arguing that we probably make better decisions that will help more people when we use our heads and use logic as opposed to using our emotions or empathy or our hearts when making decisions. He makes a few good points talking about the limitations of empathy, especially how we are more likely to be empathetic towards people who are more similar to us, leaving out other people who might need our help just as much. And he also writes about how if you are truly a good person with morals that wants to help out other people, you really don't need to feel their pain to do so. You just have to be a compassionate person. If you see a child drowning, you don't need to feel the terror of drowning to go save them. It's just kind of what you do. My problem with this book is that it would have made for an excellent essay, but there just wasn't enough material to justify reading an entire book on this subject. I mean, it was so repetitive by the end, and it seemed kind of messily organized together. I kind of wish that Paul Bloom would have taken even more of a stance on the topic because he keeps stepping back and being like, oh, but maybe empathy's good in this situation. I was kind of hoping that he was going to come out with guns blazing on the topic, but he didn't, and this ended up just kind of being a mediocre read. Then I read Meet Me in the Bathroom, Rebirth and Rock and Roll in New York City from 2001 to 2011 by Lizzy Goodman. So this is one of those rock and roll oral histories that's clearly inspired by Please Kill Me, which is a much better oral history about a much more exciting time about rock music in New York City, as in the 70s. Unfortunately, my problem with this book is that it was like so nostalgic and self-congratulatory, and I don't really think that this particular moment in rock and roll history that occurred in New York is really all that exciting or as pivotal as they make it seem. I mean, I picked up this book because I'm pretty obsessed with the Strokes, not gonna lie, love them a lot, and I wasn't disappointed by any of the Strokes material in here. I was so happy to learn more about their story. There was some good drama thrown in, but really the rest of these bands I can't say that I care all that much about. I like the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, but I don't really care that much about Interpol or LCD Sound System, so a lot of this book was kind of boring for me. I also hate when people just hype up New York endlessly, like how great it is and only authentic people live there. So this book is like 600 pages and it just grows really tiring, especially if you're like over New York City, so whatever. Read this book if you're interested in knowing more about any of these bands, but if you're looking for a better oral history on rock music in New York City, just check out Please Kill Me instead. The strangest book I read this month was definitely The Book of Jessica, A Theatrical Transformation by Linda Griffiths and Maria Campbell. So this book is in two parts. One of the parts is a play called Jessica, and the other part is all about the making of this play, and in particular, the tumultuous relationship between its two creators. My copy from the library was missing the first 15 pages, so I'm not exactly sure how Maria and Jessica ended up working together, but basically Jessica comes from a theater background, and she began working with Maria Campbell on a play that was going to be a loose retelling of Maria's life. And Maria Campbell is, of course, the author who wrote the quite famous autobiography called Half-Breed about her experiences as a Métis woman living in Canada. And what made part of this process so difficult was that not only was Linda trying to work with Maria's real life experience, she's trying to learn more about Maria and to portray Maria on stage, but Maria's Métis culture is very important to who she is as a person, and Linda Griffith was coming into this space as an outsider. She is someone who does not have a Métis background, and it's all about that difficult process with art, like what is cultural appropriation, what's theft in theater, what can you experience from another culture. There's this one scene in the book where Maria takes Linda to this spiritual gathering, and Linda starts describing what was happening, and Maria stops her, and she's saying, you can't do this, you can't talk about this. And Linda's saying, well, I never said that I wouldn't. It deals with those uncomfortable boundaries in what it's okay to experience of another person's culture and how to represent that in theater. I mean, is theater truly off limits, or are there some things that we should respect? So it is very interesting hearing these two women hash it out and talk about their emotional experiences and how they were so mad at each other. So this was quite an interesting look at a really difficult theatrical process. And then the play itself was actually not bad. It's about a woman named Jessica who is in a very turbulent time of her life, and she's got these different spirits that are possessing her. The play itself was very good, but I found myself more intrigued with the first half of this book, which is definitely worth checking out if you're interested in the difficulties of collaboration in the arts. Moving on to short stories. I read 2 collections this month that were pretty good and 2 that were not so good. So let's start off with the not so good. We have Take Us to Your Chief and Other Stories by Drew Hayden Taylor. On the back, this is labeled as classic sci-fi stories with a contemporary First Nations outlook. So a lot of these stories have funny premises. There's one in here about how the government has been using dream catchers as a way to use mind control on Aboriginal people. So that one was like entertaining. You know, each story has like a clever little twist at the end. Unfortunately, the little twists at the end of each of these stories felt kind of gimmicky. And if you take them away, these would be really boring sci-fi stories. I mean, they're not very mind-bending, and the writing is very pedestrian. The characters just aren't memorable. forgettable. The dialogue is just bad. So, like, you can kind of enjoy these stories while you're reading them, but they really didn't leave much of an impression on me, and I was definitely left wanting more out of this collection. The other short story collection that I did not care for this month was Men Without Women by Haruki Murakami, and I listened to this one on audiobook while I was driving my car. So it started off on a really sour note for me when the first story in this collection was all about the two different types of women drivers and how they're either too timid or too aggressive. And as a woman driving a car listening to that story, I was just kind of like, no thanks, I don't really care about your thoughts on this topic. So it kind of started off on the wrong foot for me, and it just didn't really get a lot better. I mean, these are stories about pretty selfish and difficult to like men, and it was just kind of boring for the most part. There's been a lot of discussion on BookTube lately about sexism in Murakami's books and whether he's worth continuing to read, and I'm not going to get into that too much. I'm just going to say that this collection of short stories really did not play to his strengths, and they don't really show what he's capable of achieving as an author. So if you are iffy and on the fence about Murakami already, definitely don't read these. They are mostly forgettable, although there is one very good one tucked away at the end, and it's kind of a reversal of Kafka's Metamorphosis. So instead of a man turning into a bug, it's about a bug who is turned into a man, and I found this story like really charming and thought-provoking. So it's too bad that it was tucked away at the end, but that one was a gem. The rest of the collection didn't really do much for me. As for short story collections that I did like, this one is Homesick for Another World by Ottessa Moshfegh. And going into this, I'd heard about how weird her characters are and how she's so gross with her writing, and she talks about all these bodily functions. So like I was expecting this to be whack, and it really wasn't. Like, her characters are kind of screw-ups. You know, they don't make the best decisions, they're kind of lonely, but I really found them to be very human and very relatable, so I just wasn't shocked by anything in this collection. It didn't really have that gross out factor that I was expecting, but still, these were a pretty decent batch of short stories. These short stories aren't very plot driven, and not a lot happens. There isn't a very satisfying narrative arc, but I more enjoyed experiencing a different slice of life with each story, being taken into this new situation and seeing what's up in a way of life that might be very different from the life that I live. So overall, I enjoyed this collection. I went and picked up a copy of Eileen after reading it, so I'm curious to see what Ottessa Moshfegh will do with a full-length novel. I also enjoyed reading Night Moves by Richard Van Camp. This collection of short stories are set in the fictional town of Fort Simmer, which is a reimagining of Fort Smith, which is where Richard Van Camp grew up in the Northwest Territories. And what I liked about this town is that it kind of has this Twin Peaks vibe, in that it is this remote town with these quirky characters and these kind of mysterious, mystical goings-on happening at night. So I enjoyed exploring this world. I think that a lot of the characters in this collection have been previously introduced in some of his earlier stories, so maybe I should have read some of his earlier stuff before going into this, but it was still pretty enjoyable. I was kind of expecting these stories to be gritty tales about what it's like to live in the Northwest Territories, but they were a lot weirder and more varied than that. There is more sci-fi and crime than I expected in these tales. There's like this mystical samurai sword that shows up in a few of these stories that I really enjoyed anytime it would pop up. So Van Camp is capable of like a wide range of stories, and some of them are hits, some of them are misses. I also wished that Van Camp was a little more descriptive with his writing. I think the Northwest Territories are such a beautiful part of the world. I would have loved to read about what it looks like there, but he really doesn't. He kind of focuses more on dialogue and plot, but still enjoyable stories for the most part, and I will be checking out more of his work in the future. Now we're moving on to the novels that I read this month, and one of them was a reread, and it was The Sirens of Titan by Kurt Vonnegut. There was this one summer, I think it was like 3 or 4 years ago, where I just read all of Kurt Vonnegut's books over the course of 2 months, and I just start missing him around this time of year, so I decided to pick this one up. This is a pretty early Vonnegut work. I think it's only his second novel, and this is definitely part of the reason why he was classified as a sci-fi author, much to his chagrin. This book is partly an adventure tale in outer space, as our main character Malachi Constant is kind of thrown about from planet to planet in this crazy journey. As he puts it, he is a victim of a series of accidents, as are we all. I really enjoyed that life philosophy, and that's what makes this a great Kurt Vonnegut novel, is he's always playing with these higher themes in his fun stories. So this one tackles religion too, and the idea of how humans sometimes think that we're like the center of the universe and that everything revolves around us. So in this novel, Kurt Vonnegut creates a new religion that acknowledges that maybe God exists, but that he just doesn't care about anyone else, or that God is not watching. And what would that mean if we weren't the performers in this play to this higher power? What freedom would that give humans if we changed how we thought about God? At the end of this book, Vonnegut reveals the hidden history of human history, what we've all been working towards this whole time, and it is very funny in a nihilistic way. So, enjoyed this one. Not my favorite Vonnegut, but still a good time. The best book that I read this month was Ravensong by Maracle, and I've talked about this book a few times on my channel already, but when I started this book, I was a little bit worried because it starts off with this very lyrical, dreamlike passage, and it put me to sleep 3 nights in a row just trying to get through the first paragraph. So I was worried. I was like, what is this novel going to entail? But then I got into it, and it was so incredible. This novel is a rich depiction of a First Nations community in coastal British Columbia during the 1950s. So Maracle really takes you to another time and another place in this book, and it's kind of a way of life that doesn't exist anymore. And we're in the mind of a teenage girl who is going through this really significant time of her life where she's questioning her values and her future, and she's really thinking about her community, and it was just a very beautiful novel. I recommend it highly. It's a little hard to find, but worth the search. This next novel is a real weird one. This one is called Where Did You Sleep Last Night by Lynn Crosbie, who's a Canadian author that I've really never heard of before. But this book is about a teenage girl who lives quite a miserable life. Her mother's abusive, she gets made fun of at school, she's not happy with her body or her appearance, and really the only meaningful thing that she has in her life is Kurt Cobain. She is in love with Kurt, she has a poster of him on her wall, and Nirvana just means the world to her. She decides that she can't take it anymore, and she tries to kill herself. Then when she wakes up, in the hospital bed next to hers is some kind of reincarnation of Kurt Cobain, and they fall in love and start making music and have this crazy dysfunctional relationship, and it just snowballs from there. So this sounds like it should be a train wreck of a novel. Like, that premise seems impossible to pull off. And in a lot of ways, this book is an homage to fanfic. This is a book that is set in a world of fantasy and not reality. It doesn't matter how Kurt Cobain has come back to life, just that he has. And like most fanfic, it is also heavily sexual in ways that are often uncomfortable. I mean, this is a teenage girl imagining these abusive and very strange sexual scenarios. This book is poetic in a punk rock kind of way, and you could tell that Lynn Crosbie is a big Nirvana fan. There are so many references to their lyrics and to Kurt Cobain's writing in here, and it's a really ballsy thing to do, trying to write about a real person in such an out there way. And especially for so many people, I mean, Kurt Cobain is like sacred. He's kind of this tragic suicide, but Lynn Crosbie just is not afraid to just try out a bunch of things, and she definitely captures the weirdness of Kurt and Nirvana. Like, this book is just so strange. My complaint with it is that this bizarre writing and this rock star cliche fantasy grows tiring. I mean, this novel is 400 pages, and there's only so much that you can take of this druggy writing style. Against all the odds, this book was somehow successful. I think especially when you consider the main character Evelyn's background at the start of the book. Her fantasies take on a different tone when you remember that she lives in this abusive household. I mean, how is she supposed to know what a normal normal relationship looks like when she doesn't have one to mirror that off of in her real life. I mean, she is someone who is craving affection and love, and then she creates this fantasy where she can have all of that, even if it is an obsessive, unhealthy love. There's something so tragic about that. This book is a huge mess. It's very chaotic, but it's also very creative, and I found myself quite moved by the end. So if you are a Kurt Cobain fan, not afraid to try something a little different, I would recommend giving this a try. And last up, we have my Dostoevsky of the month. This one was called Netochka Nezvanova, and this is an unfinished novel of his. Pretty cool. We have a female protagonist in this one, and we see her at 3 different points in her upbringing. And I have to say that this novel had an amazing start. Like, the first 60 pages are incredible. She has this stepfather who thinks that he's like the greatest musician, but he's really not, and he's just kind of a drunk. And there are parts in here about their dysfunctional home life that I just like ate it up. It was so good. It would be like her mom would give her some money to go to the store to buy the food that they needed because this family's dirt poor, and then the father would be like, give me the money, because he wanted to buy alcohol, and this girl was like so conflicted about what she should do, and it was just like such a weird, tense beginning. It gets a little mystical what happens to the stepfather, and then it just kind of abruptly stops, and then she's sent to a new home, and she lives with this prince and has a bit of a lesbian crush on this princess, so that was kind of transgressive. And then again, kind of abrupt halt, and then she moves to another home, and some drama goes down there, but it's just not as juicy. So this novel loses steam as it goes along, and then it just kind of ends there. I think Siberian prison camp got in the way, so Dostoevsky never finished this book. I'm curious to see where he would have taken it. Definitely has a promising beginning. I would have loved to have seen the themes from the beginning get played out in a longer novel, but alas, that is not what we have. We only have this kind of strange fragment, but it's short, it's worth having a look at, and I enjoyed it for the most part. So that's it for my June wrap-up. I am still currently working my way through Don Quixote. I finished part 1, and I am just trying to plow through and finish this by the end of July. Really still enjoying this. And I'm also right now reading a collection of 3 novels by César Aira, and I'm almost finished Ghosts right now, and I just love this writer, so I'm looking forward to continuing to work my way through this. Please let me know what you have read this month or what you're currently reading right now, and thank you for watching this stupidly long video. See you next time. Bye.